Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. It is session 4 of The Name of the Rose this evening, as we return to, well, not, we're done with the church door, but we are going to continue to work through, I hope, a significant chunk of day 1 here today, beginning with the discussion with Ubertino about heresy. Right, Argent Paintbrush asks, but is the church door done with you? And I doubt it, actually. I doubt it. We'll return to that. Doubtless. Or it may return to us, right? We'll see. One quick announcement I wanted to make. One of the things that we are... that we're thinking about doing, one of the things that I would really like to see, one of my goals for the next 6 to 12 months. I would love to. We're working on expanding some of the programming that we have at Mythgard. I'd love to bring in more voices, have more people doing stuff at Mythgard. I don't mean like this broadcast specifically, but just other people broadcasting stuff. And so we may have some new stuff available on the Mythgard podcast. So it may well come that interspersed with my sessions here from the Mythgard Academy on the Mythgard podcast feed, we may have some new folks. So just to warn you, so if you're listening to this on the podcast feed, new things on the podcast feed that are not me or sessions of this class or its successors may be coming down the feed. So anyway, I just was wanting to kind of let folks know this is, I'm not sure exactly when that's going to happen. There may be some things sooner. There may be more things later. This is, it's not one of the highest priority things that we're doing at Signum, but it's definitely something that I've been thinking about. I've long been wanting to recruit some more people who, have some fun things to say, to be able to put stuff out through Mythgard. So it's a thing that may be happening that I just didn't want anyone to be taken by surprise. As I say, it's not going to disrupt what we're doing here on Wednesday nights. And the well, I was about to say the regular stream of content through the podcast feed. Regular is really probably a claim I cannot make, actually, but I'm trying to think of a flattering adjective I could use instead, but I'm coming up empty. In any case, I just wanted to let folks know so that, again, if you are subscribed to our podcast feed, you may be hearing some new things, which you can, choose to listen to or not or whatever. But it's going to be, I think it's going to be good fun. So anyway, all right. But let's get back into the book here this evening. So, we just met, what's his name? Salvatore, the one who speaks the language of Babel, right? Whose language was associated with the confusion of languages at Babel, right? Which I think is a really important element. Certainly connected to the themes that we've been looking at, in particular the way in which signs and things, right? Signs and the things they point to are just a pervasive concern of this book. So you'll remember that he had said that Salvatore's language was not... it was strange to him. And so one kind of theory that he raised is that maybe he was speaking the Adamic language, meaning the language inherited from Adam prior to, in the ancient days before the Tower of Babel. When all of the world spoke one single language. So there's this idea, there's a sort of mythic idea of this original language, that from which all other languages have fallen away. The implication that the sort of the mythic concept, it's mythic, it's not scientific, it's not philological, right? It is a mythic idea that there was a sort of perfection of language, which would mean, of course, a perfect way of the word pointing to the, when you think about conceptually what a perfect language means, right? The closing of the gap between the sign and the thing, ways where like the right and best word to apply to that thing, right? Those kinds of ideas are associated with the Adamic language. After the Tower of Babel, or Babel, I say both off and on. The name is essentially Babylon. I mean, it's the city is pretty clearly identified with Babylon in Genesis chapter 11. But anyway, after the Tower of Babel, when the languages are confused, after the confusion of when God descends and confuses the language of the people, everyone then speaks different languages, and that's the origin of modern language. That's the origin of modern language divisions. Again, according to this sort of mythic version, that's the origin of language divisions. So again, you may remember that when he speaks of Salvatore, he says his language wasn't the Adamic language, nor is it any of the individual languages spoken post Tower of Babel. But it is the language of the primordial, of the confusion itself, right? He is not, Salvatore's language doesn't just recall the confusion of the languages at Babel. It is like an embodiment of that confusion itself. The imperfection and imprecision of his language and the way in which words and things are attached to each other. And I agree, Maureen, the kind of the ultimate image is the idea of in the beginning is the word, yes, and in the beginning God's creation through words, right? When God says, "Let there be light," the name, the word, and the thing are the same, right? There is, in God's own language, there is no gap whatsoever. There is perfect identity between name and thing, between word and thing, between sign and thing. The sign is the thing. God says the thing, and it is, right? Anyway, so yes, so the Adamic language is sort of an echo of that, right? Anyway, this is the lead-in. The brief encounter with Salvatore is the lead-in to the meeting with Ubertino, and his long conversation with Brother William. Now, this is an interesting conversation in a lot of ways, and I know this is something. It takes a peculiar set of hobbies to be prepared to take an inordinate amount of interest in the details of the particular heretical disputes and political machinations between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, and among the different sects of Franciscans and everything else that's going on there. Oh man, JJ, that is such a wormhole. JJ saying, I just discovered that there's an entire Wikipedia page specifically for the one sentence Nimrod speaks in Inferno. 100%. Oh man, like that is what Nimrod says is, that's a huge mystery. Yeah, that's an enormous, one Wikipedia page is a small gesture towards the amount of ink that has been dedicated to that one sentence uttered by Nimrod in Dante's Inferno. Oh my goodness. Yes. Anyhow, okay. So, Yeah. Anyways, JJ's thinking about that both because we just did Dante's Inferno recently, and because Nimrod is one of the characters who's he's not associated with the Tower of Babel in the sense that, like, in the story he builds it or something. He comes into the story just before, but he's one of these heroes of old that is mentioned in the text right before that, basically. Okay. Anyway, so back to Ubertino and the heresies. I warned before, a couple classes ago, actually, which in real time was ages ago, that I'm not going to get into too many of the details as far as the Italian political situation is concerned, nor am I particularly interested in the nitty-gritty of the heretical matters, right? I think it's, on the one hand, I'm happy, I hope you are happy too, if we have, like, enough understanding of what is at stake here to understand. I will say it would be fun to talk about the film adaptation of this book afterwards. I haven't seen that film in a very long time. I'm going to be interested to rewatch it after we finish discussing the book. But I do remember one of the scenes that sticks out in my memory is the reference to this particular heretical dispute. That there's like, they play it for a joke, basically, right? That, like, we are gathered here today to discuss the critical question of whether Christ owned his own clothes, right? And then everybody bursts out into violence. And it seemed to me that the film was basically kind of playing that for a laugh, essentially, inviting a modern audience just to sort of laugh and ridicule at the silly argument that is being made by these medieval monks. I might be doing an injustice to the film, especially since, again, that's based on a memory. As I said, I haven't seen it in many, many years, but that's the impression that scene made upon me when I watched it. It's one of the few things from that film that I remember very, very clearly. I wouldn't want us only to have that sort of an understanding of what's going on here. One of the things that so Adso, of course, not our Adso character, the Adso narrator, pauses and gives us some background before we meet Ubertino, right? He provides some background, and one of the things that he makes clear is the relationship between the doctrinal dispute, that is, the argument about ideas, and the political situation. That the problem with the spirituals, as they're called, so he describes the issue first and foremost in political terms. That the Franciscan order had become very, very popular and thus very, very powerful, and that many great and learned men were coming from and were increasingly dominating the schools, and that other people in other factions were feeling politically threatened within the structure of the church. And so they basically made a political move against them, and managed to get many of the core beliefs of this sort of one main group of them declared heresy. And that's sort of a very, very rough part of the debate. But again, Adso explains it. Politics first and doctrine second. This is not the issue there, again, as it's presented to us. The issue is not simply everyone was earnestly trying to understand the truth of this matter, right? There's this very, very important issue, and everyone is trying to understand this. And, by the way, it happened to have significant significant political consequences. That's not how he characterizes it. In fact, you'll even remember that there are several times where he points to how the political factors of the situation end up bringing about several things which seem kind of absurd on the surface. Like, for instance, some of the wealthiest lords and rulers siding with the people who are arguing for poverty and against riches, right? You know, they're saying everyone should be poor and should leave their possessions. And so you have the wealthiest people saying, yes, we side with them because of where the political lines were drawn. And and so the narrator sort of saying it may seem strange, right? That ended up happening. There's another moment where he says something similar when he says that, like, in order to make the political move, in order to basically not alienate, but kind of push out that one particular faction of the Franciscans, the Pope had been compelled to make a very strong statement against the idea that Jesus was poor. Because if he were to concede that Jesus was poor and owned nothing himself, then he would concede the ground upon which again the point is that Adso observes somewhat, like, dispassionately. He doesn't sound like he's taking sides, right? He's not making fun of anybody in particular. Indeed, those two scenes that I'm pointing to, the one where he says the Pope's declaration that it is heresy to claim that Jesus was poor, is pretty weird. Like, that doesn't actually make very much sense, right? Like, why should it be wrong or harmful, right? To say that Jesus was poor, like, he wasn't he poor? I mean, like, is that controversial? Like, why is that? Why should you make a big deal of it? It's certainly a big deal of it to the point of saying that you're a heretic if you say it, that Jesus is poor. So, Adso is saying that's kind of absurd. But when he says that it's absurd for people like Count Orsini, who was the supporter of Ubertino, who is one of the wealthiest people in Italy, that for him to be like the great advocate and defender of the poverty movement was really absurd. So there, he's criticizing both sides, basically, of that whole political world. So, in any case, what the biggest thing that I would want to draw attention to in all that, again, I'm not particularly interested in the details of the debate, but here's where I think it's important. Here's where I think it interacts, especially with the primary themes that we've been looking at so far. And that is, think about what this means about signs and things, right? One of the things that Adso comes back to, one of the things he keeps drawing our attention to, is that the things that are being said, there's this large gap. The political situation, the political motivations of things are introducing a very significant gap between the things that people are saying and what they really mean, and any kind of, like, sort of substance of that and everything. Yes, Eric, it's exactly true that the spiritual Franciscans were concluding that because Jesus was poor, all Christians were required to be materially poor. But again, that's exactly where Adso, the narrator, was saying, and so isn't it strange that Ubertino, who's one of the spiritual Franciscans, was closely allied by and in fact living in the home of Count Orsini, the enormously wealthy, Italian nobleman. That's exactly sort of the kind of thing. And again, I think the important thing that I would emphasize, exactly, Eric, that's just right. That's only possible if a theological issue isn't really what motivates everyone. Yes, and I think that the sort of overall summary and analysis of the political and theological situation that Adso gives us in the middle of that sixth chapter, is it shows that the theological issue isn't really what's motivating anyone involved in this situation, and that the whole thing, I mean, some more than others, right? Some to a greater extent than others, but for none of them is this merely a question about truth, but rather the question of truth or defining truth is sort of the weapon that's being used for these other purposes, right? So to say, I am standing in defense of poverty and the principle that everyone should be poor, everyone who claims to follow Jesus should be poor as Jesus was poor. That's a simple statement, right? There's a logic to that, right? But if you say that while being Count Orsini, right, or while living in the home of Count Orsini luxuriously, there are issues there, right? And those issues are, again, it's on both sides of the question there. When we get into the conversation, not into Adso's summary of the situation, but into the actual conversation between Ubertino and William, we will see the same kinds of things coming out again, and that's what I want to emphasize now as we're going through. Yeah, Steve, I think that's exactly right. Theology was the politics of the 13th century. Well, or at least let me say, it might be more accurate to say that theology was one of the primary vocabularies of the politics of the 13th century, and 14th century, and 15th century. That is, and 16th century, and 17th century, right? I mean, it's like in the Renaissance, this is so clear as well, during the Reformation. But yeah, that, because it is, I mean, explicitly politics. It's power politics between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, or between the Pope and the anti-Pope, right? Factions within the Church. But theology is the language of that debate, right? If you can demonstrate sort of official, like you can win the political debate. It's like when you bring two sides of a political dispute into a public debate in the Middle Ages, it's theology they're debating, right? That's how you win a debate. That's how you try to gain support for your side, essentially. But anyway, that's one of the things that we definitely see what happens there. But anyway, okay. As I say, what I want to shift to, because I want to kind of show the continuity there between the political theological debates, which are going to be coming in. There's going to be a debate held here. The did Jesus own his clothes debate. People are coming to the Abbey in order to have that discussion, as William and Ubertino were discussing. But yeah. Yeah, JJ, you're right. I'm reminded of Galileo's trouble being primarily political, but his enemies couching their arguments in theological terms. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There was a lot of politics involved with the characterization of the Galileo issue as like church versus science is a massive misunderstanding of the whole way the world worked at the time of Galileo, honestly. Either to understand like the church as in some sense unified against Galileo as a scientist, or of Galileo putting forward his ideas exclusively as a scientist, as against religion. Like just that whole characterization of the Galileo situation is a very, very persistent projection of modern categories back upon that time. But that's a different story. It's a different story, but it's related to the kind of stuff that we've just been talking about. Anyway, okay. Let's look at when William and Ubertino start to have a disagreement about Claire, one of the holy women who has had a profound impact on Ubertino, as he explains. The sainted Claire, whom, just to make sure for anyone who is kind of peripherally aware, the Saint Clare in question is not the Saint Clare who was the close associate of Saint Francis of Assisi. Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Clare, they worked together like that was, they were very close. This is not that Saint Clare. This is a different Saint Clare. I was confused when I was going there. I was like, is he talking about Saint Clare? Like that Saint Clare? Saint Francis is Saint Clare? And then I was looking it up and I'm like, yeah, no, that's a different Saint Clare. So anyway, just in case anyone was confused about that. Yeah, exactly. Saint Francis and that Saint Clare were a century before this. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Ubertino had just said to William, remember how affectionately William is greeted by Ubertino. They haven't seen each other for 18 years. And Ubertino it shows great personal affection for William when he greets him again. Okay, so Ubertino has just said that he had wished that William had agreed to help him in the holy endeavor that he was undertaking, the holy endeavor which he characterizes as promoting and defending the life and reputation of this other Saint Clare, of this great woman, Clare, that he is talking about. And William says, but the holy endeavor that you invited me to share was sending Bentivenga, Giacomo, and Giovannuccio to the stake, William said softly. They were besmirching her memory with their perversions, and you were an inquisitor. And that was precisely when I asked to be relieved of that position. Right? So you'll remember we learned in his conversation with the abbot, the first, right after they arrived at the abbey, that he had stepped down, that he was no longer acting as an inquisitor, right? And we are now learning this is the event. Ubertino's campaign against these three male followers, associates of Clare, was the moment that he stepped down. Argent Paintbrush, I agree that this conversation is a bit horrifying to listen to. Yes, it is. Yes. We're going to persevere through it. And I want to focus on, remember what we were talking about politics and theology. Remember, though it's been a while since we've had live class, remember our discussions about signs and things, about how words point to things. We can learn a lot more about both how William thinks and acts, and by looking at Ubertino by contrast, we can see some of the pressures, some of the places where William is differing, and why from these things. Okay. They were besmirching her memory with their perversions, and you were an inquisitor. And that was precisely when I asked to be relieved of that position. I did not like the business, nor did I like, I shall be frank, the way you induced Bentivenga to confess his errors. You pretended you wished to enter his sect, if sect it was. You stole his secrets from him, and you had him arrested. But that is the way to proceed against the enemies of Christ. They were heretics. They were pseudo-apostles. They reeked of the sulfur of Fra Dolcino. They were Clare's friends. No, William, you must not cast even the hint of a shadow on Claire's memory. So notice what is at stake. What does William dislike? What bothers him? What's the first thing that he mentions, right? He says, I did not like the bit. He refused to be part of this Inquisition. The Inquisition of Bentivenga, Giacomo, and Giovannuccio. Sorry, I have a hard time with that one. Giovannuccio. Which ended up, all three of them ended up being burnt to death as heretics, right? So this is obviously important. This is the thing that led him to stop being an inquisitor. So we should clearly pay attention to that. Remember that from the beginning, from that first conversation with the abbot, William's, his reputation, his being an inquisitor, his reputation as an inquisitor, and his discussion of what it meant to be an inquisitor and what was like, you know, good and bad about inquisitions, right? These are all things that were associated for us with his like being a detective from the beginning, right? So clearly this is important for us to understand. Okay. But again, notice what's his problem? What first and foremost, so yes, like you got them burned at the stake and he didn't want any part of that, right? We'll get more on that later on. But the first thing he emphasizes is the way you induced Bentivenga to confess his errors. Confession. Confession is what inquisitors are attempting to get, right? What is a confession? A confession is when the person who has done wrong uses their words, right? Speaks to point to, so that their words point to the things that they did. They want that to be, that's proof, right? When they confess with their own mouth the evil deeds that they did. When the words point to the things, that's conclusive, right? When their words point to the things. And so, yeah, the lack of integrity, Yarrow, on Ubertino's part. He lied in order to trick Bentivenga into his confession, according to William. You pretended you wished to enter his sect, if sect it was. You stole his secrets from him, and you had him arrested, right? So that Ubertino approached Bentivenga on false pretenses and deceived him. William, broadly speaking, William is objecting to the fact that Ubertino used falsehood in order to get at what he claims to be the truth, right? So that's a problem, right? Notice Ubertino's very weak defense. That is the way to proceed against the enemies of Christ. His response is essentially, but that works. And it's okay. It's not wrong. Why is it not wrong in his mind? Why is it not wrong to act in that way? To use falsehood in order to try to get at truth? Because his ends are righteous, right? It's a means and ends question in his mind. Totally a means and ends question, right? The ends justify the means. Plain and simple, Catriona, exactly as you say. Exactly. And yes, it does. Yeah, Eric, I think that's a good way to say it. If you're evil, you've forfeited your rights. Yes, exactly. They were heretics. That's like his answer, right? You like, what do they have, rights or something, right? I mean, it doesn't matter, right? Yes, and Emily, you are right to remember Faramir's assertion that he would not ensnare even an orc with a falsehood, right? This is exactly the moral slope that Faramir is staying so very far away from. Yeah. Mrs. Manrique, I agree that many arguments throughout this book seem so bad. Yeah, absolutely. The point that I would make, the thing that I would urge you to do, is to look at not just, and see, again, this is where I felt, assuming I'm not retroactively doing an injustice to the film. Again, that moment in the film where that, where the debate about Jesus owning his own clothing seemed to me to be held up to ridicule. It's one thing to say, oh yes, they're making all of these, the whole situation, the whole theological, political debate is absurd, right? Sure. But if all you do is laugh at it and move on, you've missed the point, right? I do think that Echo is inviting us to see the absurdity of these things. But what is the absurdity he's inviting us to see, right? That's the thing we need to make sure that we can perceive. Let's keep going. They were Minorites, meaning Franciscans, whose minds were aflame with the same visions as Claire's, and often the step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy is very brief, William said. Pausing for a second to contextualize the rather remarkable conversation that is about to happen. This might strike you as very, very strange. So let me provide for a little bit of context. There was a robust tradition in the Middle Ages of ecstatic visions, what was called categorically contemplative literature. That is the literature of people who generally retreated into solitude and had visions. Some of these are very famous, like Julian of Norwich, for instance. She was a visionary who was recording her visions. There were many people like this who were recording visions that they had. One frequent motif that went through is a kind of ecstatic experience that accompanies the vision, the description of which either sounds or in some sense is extremely sexual. This was especially common. Is this fair to say? Well, I'll just say it. Well, let me say it a different way. There were several notable examples of this happening among female mystics. Often a female mystic would describe a vision in which Jesus appeared to her. And it's not that there was not like a description of sexual intercourse with Jesus or something like that, but the description of her bliss upon encountering Jesus was couched in very, if you read it out of context, you would very likely take it for erotic poetry, basically. It's a thing. That's it. It's just, and so this question about the line between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy, this was debated. Like, there were a bunch of people in the Middle Ages who were like, I think these people are well-intentioned, but yikes. Right? I mean, like, there were people who were a little concerned about this, and they're like, where are the lines here? What exactly is happening here? And there were many people, of course, who very strongly defended it, right? And said, basically, like, if you are reading this and you're thinking about sex, that's a you problem, okay? Like, this is not a sexual experience. And they would say, and there is some sort of plausibility to the idea that basically, like, the problem was that the language that you use to describe this transcendent experience and the language that is used to describe the erotic experience, that visionary ecstasy and orgasm were often, like, described using very similar language. And they're like, what other language is there to describe? I mean, like, the fact that they're similar is, like, not our fault, right? In fact, anyway, it's a whole thing. I'm just saying it's a whole thing. So if this seems like super weird or out there to you, I'm not saying it's not weird and out there, but I am saying this is not Umberto Eco being weird. This is him addressing a legitimate thing that happened in the Middle Ages. Yes, the spiritual and the carnal are sometimes intermixed. And Mrs. Manrique, this is this is made particularly one of the hard things is that, of course, at the same time as you have these accounts of these sort of ecstatic experiences, or even people together, like not just alone in solitude, but a group of people together praying and having this ecstatic experience, which sounds even sketchier, and indeed sounds quite similar to the inevitable stories which circulated about scandalous sexual goings-on between monks and nuns, right? There were always stories about that. And anyway, you see what I mean? So, as I say, it was an issue. And that issue, notice how William draws attention to that issue. The step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy is very brief. Now, notice what's at stake there. What's at stake is, you've got the words. What are the words pointing to? What are the things that lie behind those words? If you describe illicit sexual passion in the same words that you describe beatific vision, right? The purest possible encounter with the divine on the one hand, or the seamiest, raciest sexual encounter on the other hand. If the words are identical, but the things are so different from each other, right? Where does that leave us in thinking about words? Like, what are we supposed to do with this, right? How do we handle that? How do we interpret that? Anyway, so, good. Belfengus, I'm glad this helps to know that this was a real historical thing and not just the author being weird. Yeah. Now, again, not saying he's not being weird. I'm not saying he's not making it weird a little bit. But again, these are legitimate issues here. Okay. Anyway, so William has just pointed out the step between the two of them is very brief, which is an interesting way to describe it. It's a very brief step. So again, notice that he's saying you can go from one to the other really easily, right? Ubertino wrung his hands and his eyes were again veiled with tears. Don't say that, William. How can you confound the moment of ecstatic love, which burns the viscera with the perfume of incense and the disorder of the senses which reeks of sulfur? Bentivenga urged others to touch a body's naked limbs. He declared this was the only way to freedom from the dominion of the senses. Homo nudus cum nuda jacebat. Naked they lay together, man and woman. Et non commiscebantur ad invincem. Invincem. I am bad at church Latin, as I say. But there was no conjunction, right? So naked they lay together, man and woman, but there was no conjunction. Lies, he says. Ubertino responds. They were seeking pleasure, and they found it. If carnal stimulus was felt, they did not consider it a sin if, to satisfy it, man and woman lay together, and the one touched and kissed the other in every part, and naked belly was joined to naked belly. Now notice what happens next. This is Adso speaking. I confess that the way Ubertino stigmatized the vice of others did not inspire virtuous thoughts in me. My master must have realized I was agitated, and he interrupted the holy man. Right. I love that paragraph. That is an awesome paragraph, which also, by the way, touches on an entire big thing, huge thing, in medieval church practice. But that sentence, I confess that the way Ubertino stigmatized the vice of others did not inspire virtuous thoughts in me, right? Here's poor teenage Adso listening to this conversation and being like, getting hot in here, is it just me? Right? I mean, whew. Yeah. The things that he's describing here, Ubertino, I mean, right? He's totally against it, right? He's describing these things in order to condemn them in the harshest possible terms. And now here's Adso like, and I can't unsee this in my mind. Right? Yes, I agree. Diego says, did not inspire virtuous thoughts in me is hot. Exactly. He's a little agitated. Right? Yes, he was. Notice, back to what William said, the step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy is very brief. Right. What is the difference? It's one thing. Ubertino can say that the moment of ecstatic love and the disorder of the senses, right? That is the ecstatic encounter with the divine on the one hand, and a seamy carnal sexual encounter on the other hand, are worlds and worlds apart. Like, I mean, they're nothing to do with each other. But William says, no, there's a brief step in between the two of them. Why? Because the words are the same. So what's the difference? How do you make the brief step? What is the difference? Adso gives us the answer. Adso demonstrates the answer, right? The answer is your own mind. What are you thinking of? Right? What are you focused on? Is it possible to use those words to describe God? Yes. Yes, it is. Is it possible to use those words to describe a sexual encounter? Yes. Yes, you can use exactly those same words. And giving Ubertino every possible benefit of the doubt that his dwelling upon the carnal act, as he's describing it here, that he is doing so for no other reason whatsoever than to condemn it in the sternest possible terms, and not because he himself is enjoying lingering on it in his own imagination as he speaks. I'm sure that wasn't the case. He's just condemning it. It's not where it takes Adso's mind, right? The words are saying, condemn this thing, but the thing that's being pointed to, his Adso's mind and heart and attention, right? His own thoughts are not being directed towards virtue, but towards vice. I said that this paragraph raises what was a huge issue, especially in the 14th century. So that is, for the next 100 years, right after this story takes place, this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. Let me explain briefly, as briefly as I can. So there will soon, I don't remember when exactly, be a papal edict that will require all Christians to take communion at least once a year. That may seem weird. That was not, like, it was not common for most people to take communion all the time. That it's like, you know, modern Catholics take communion every week, right, at Mass, whatever, as often as they go to Mass. That was not the common practice in the Middle Ages. But everyone was required to do it at least once a year, which means, and there's there's a kind of a domino effect from that decree. The first of which is, in order to take communion, you have to go to confession. You have to confess and be absolved of your sins. In order, that's a prerequisite, right? You can't go and take communion with all of your sins still upon your soul. So you have to take communion. So confession also becomes something that is, by rule now, participated in at least annually by everybody, literally every adult person, right, in the Christian world. So again, confession was a thing. It was, it's not like they invented confession or something. As we've already seen, there have been several references to confession here. It plays a role in the story already. Anyway, so confession was not that commonly used among the laity, among the common people. But everybody's got to do it now. So, there was a sort of a cottage industry in confessional manuals. Because now, like, parish priests, like, they've got to hear confessions from everybody in town, like, at least once a year, and often more frequently than that. So, they better brush up on their confessional technique, right? And so get confessional manuals, how to sort of catalogs of sins, like, let's help you to understand, so that you can understand what is an appropriate penance in order. So it's like some confessional manuals were kind of like the what's it called, the I'm blanking on the title. The publication of the American Psychiatric Society that lists all of the psychiatric disorders. What's that publication? I'm blanking on the title of it. The DSM. Yeah. Confessional manuals were, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. A lot of the confessional manuals were just like that, basically. Like, here is a catalog of all the sins that there are, right? And just so that you can understand, so you can diagnose them, right? When you hear about them, diagnose them and know what kind of penances to give and stuff to be able to help people, sort of through and come out of these problems. But there are also then, like, a lot of advice about technique, because Adso's problem here are Eric, the confessional manuals existed way back, right? I mean, as soon as there was confession, there were confessional manuals. As I say, they just got real popular in the 14th century when there was a whole lot more confession going on. And one of the things that they discussed in these was, they're like, okay, so when you're confessing people, you got to be careful here, right? Because you've got to pay attention to where you are focusing the minds of people, right? Because, so, like, imagine, you don't, like, here's a classic blunder, right? By an inexperienced parish priest here in confession. By the way, medieval confession, no boxes. You know how you give, how you do, the priest is sitting in a chair and you kneel in front of him. It's face to face, right? So, classic confessional blunder. Priest sitting in his chair, parishioner kneeling in front of him. Parishioner says, bless me, Father, I confess that I've been having sexual thoughts, right? And the priest, here's the classic blunder, the priest says, tell me about those. Right? And then the person is like, well, right? And that's, oh boy, doorward. It was the beginning. It sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of like several stories in the Decameron is what it's the beginning of, right? So and you know, again, like, it's not hard to see the scurrilous stories that come with this, right? Like fetching young lass from the village, kneeling in front of the priest, saying she's had impure thoughts, and the priest saying, "Tell me about those, my daughter," right? I mean, like, seriously, like, you can see how this can easily get completely out of hand. Anyway, but so, like I said, but this, what Adso is experiencing here, right, is exact. So like, it's not only for like the priest, it's not only for the person confessing's sake, right? You don't want to, like, don't lead their mind in that direction. Again, the whole point is to help them out of this, right? I agree, Eric, that confession boxes were a good innovation. Anyway, but of course there's also the priest's own mind to worry about, right? Because it is always possible that hearing the confession of the vice of others might not inspire virtuous thoughts in the priest either, right? This is the thing to be guarded against. This is a big slippery slope, right? And again, what's at stake here? What's the issue here? The issue is the very brief step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy, right? Words and the things that they're pointing to, because one of the elements involved there is the intention of the person who utters the words and the intention of the person who receives the words. And those two things can sometimes be at odds, right? And remember, that's exactly what's at issue with the approach that Ubertino took to Bentivenga that William objected to, right? He felt that his motivations, his intentions were pure, even though the words that he was uttering were lies, right? And William disagrees with that, right? Yes. And yes, Eric and Argent Paintbrush are very correct that to reveal anything that you heard in confession is a very, very bad, you can't do it. This is why the abbot, in that first scene with Brother William, said the most that he could say, exceptionally indirectly, leading William to conclude that the abbot had heard something in confession that bore upon this case, but which meant the abbot couldn't really pursue it because he knew something. He knew something about what happened, about the death, but he couldn't say anything about it or do anything about it because he'd heard about it under the seal of confession. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah. Yes, it would mean that murderers in general wouldn't go to confession, or they would lie. I mean, having already sinned capitally. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Argent Paintbrush, this is exactly why you will see Brother William refuse to hear confession from someone later on. Absolutely. Yes. And it is true. Jocelyn, it's a great question about the difference between the confession that an inquisitor extracts from the victim, right? You know, from the person that they're, what's the verb? Inquisiting? Inquiring doesn't seem quite right. Anyway, the difference is that when someone comes to undertake confession, like that is a sacrament. They are entering into a sacred relationship. A sacrament means, like, this is a place where the divine and the human touch. Like, that is the presence of God is there at the sacrament of confession. But the sacrament of confession is all about the voluntary the voluntary choice of the person to come and enter into that. Right. Offering your confession versus having your confession forced out of you. Yes. And again, even the word literally, no, I mean, Jocelyn, you're right. And William's going to talk about this. The confessions extorted by the inquisitors are voluntary, right? I mean, the people said them. And we will see in a moment, if I ever do, in fact, advance the slide, Ubertino talking about it in that way. But anyway, yes, it is all about the context, which is kind of true of all of the sacraments, right? You can get wet under lots of circumstances, right? But that doesn't make it baptism, right? You can eat bread on lots of occasions. You can even eat bread in church, and that doesn't make it, communion. And of course, to come back to the uncomfortable subject of this slide, you can have sex under many different circumstances, but that doesn't make it marriage, right? Bricktails, yes. Umberto Eco provides us a little cue by starting that last paragraph with "I confess," right, by Edzo. Yeah, that's a little medieval priest humor there at the beginning of that paragraph. Yes. Okay, but more on this. Let's keep going. They were not pseudo-apostles. Sorry, this is William. They were not pseudo-apostles. They were brothers of the free spirit. You said as much yourself. That's what they called themselves. That's the kind of name that people like these kind of contemplatives would sort of give themselves. They were not pseudo-apostles. They were brothers of the free spirit. You said as much yourself. What difference is there? You haven't heard everything about that trial. I myself never dared record certain confessions, for fear of casting, if only for a moment, the shadow of the devil on the atmosphere of sanctity Clare had created in that place. But I learned certain things, William. They gathered at night in a cellar. They took a newborn boy. They threw him from one to another until he died, of blows or other causes. And he who caught him alive for the last time and held him as he died became the leader of the sect. And the child's body was torn to pieces and mixed with flour to make blasphemous hosts. The host is the piece of bread that is used in communion. The idea of a blasphemous or satanic host is it's a common accusation in a situation like this. Ubertino, William said firmly. These things were said many centuries ago by the Armenian bishops about the sect of the Paulicians and about the Bogomils. Let's make sure that we understand. Bricktail says it sounds like the blood libel of the Jews. Almost exactly. And that's precisely the point. Okay. That's directly related to the point that William is making. Do you see what William is accusing him of? What he's saying about Ubertino? How he is not correcting, chastising Ubertino here. He's saying, Ubertino, you got that out of a book. This isn't what's his name? Bentavengo did. This is you got that out of a book. That's word for word the accusations made by the Armenian bishops about the sect of the Paulicians and about the Bogomils, right? Notice, by the way, that in saying it that way, Brother William is throwing shade at the Armenian bishops who wrote that book many centuries ago, right? That they made precisely the same accusation. Like, really? There are these two different heretical sects that do this same chuck the baby around ritual? Like, really? Okay, right. I mean, there's some significant skepticism implied by William in that terse little comment. But the important thing is that he got it out of a book. Remember the point about auctoritas. Remember the Brunellus, the horse? Remember what William said about the description of the horse? Why did William know for certain? How did William possibly... How do you do it, Holmes, right? How did he possibly know how the horse would be described by the monks? Because he knew that they would think the horse looked like that. They would certainly use those words to describe him, because that's how Isidore Seville described a beautiful horse in the etymologies. This is one of the things that modern people misunderstand most about the Middle Ages. So it's important. Try to wrap your brain around this. We, modern people, have been taught to look at the Middle Ages as illiterate. The Middle Ages were far more bookish than the modern ages are. Far more bookish. They read more and more carefully. They memorized more. They lived their lives out of books in ways unlike any modern people do. Almost any modern people. And this is often true even of people who cannot themselves read, because they are steeped in these stories. Remember, they have no other entertainment, right? This is what they did. Read books. It's all exactly, Jocelyn. No TV, no internet. This is what they had. In any case, for this reason, the weight of authority that was vested, the way in which the things you read could shape the way that you looked at the world, right? The way that you described things, the way in which you would reach acts, even like without knowing it, for the vocabulary from, an authoritative text that you know really well in order to describe something. Again, that's the sort of joke that Brother Williams is making with the horse thing, right? It's the point that he's making, which is kind of a joke. We see the same issue coming up here again, but in a much, much darker way, right? There is this famous book that is written by these Armenian bishops that Brother William has read. I almost called him Sir William. That Brother William has read. And he, Ubertino, knows it too, right? Everybody's read this book, right? And of course, it's a book that tells this like super sensational story, a super sensational story with which it is trying to demonize the particular heretical sects, plural, right? That these Armenian bishops were condemning in this work. And of course, remember Adso's political context, remember politics and theology. We have reason perhaps to share some of William's skepticism that either that the Armenian bishops were perfectly factual in their descriptions here, or totally objective in their assessment of these heretical sects. Oh, JJ, my goodness. Yeah, there's so many more flat earthers today than back then, both in number and by percentage. Nobody thought the world was flat in the Middle Ages. Everybody knew the world was round. Only modern people came up with the flat earth idea. And by the way, then projected it upon Enlightenment scholars were completely irresponsible in this sort of regard. The way in which earlier times, the way in which they printed things they knew full well to be lies about the things that people used to believe in order to make them sound dumber and us modern people sound smarter is quite shameless, in my opinion. 18th and 19th century textbooks are horrible in this regard. Anyway, yeah, sorry. As a medievalist, it's one of my bones to pick against the Enlightenment. Yeah. Okay. Anyway. Back to Ubertino. So what is Ubertino is saying that Bentivengo confessed to doing these things. The baby chucking circle, and all that stuff. Like, this is... Bentivengo said, we totally did all those things. Yeah. Under torture, he confessed these things. And Ubertino is here saying that he, suppressed that. He didn't even report this confession. Right. Yeah. Anyway, William pulls him up for it. And he says, those things were said centuries ago. Ubertino's response: what does that matter? The devil is stubborn. He follows a pattern in his snares and his seductions. He repeats his rituals at a distance of millennia. He is always the same. This is precisely why he is recognized as the enemy. I swear to you, they lighted candles on Easter night and took maidens into the cellar. Then they extinguished the candles and threw themselves on the maidens, even if they were bound to them by ties of blood. And if from this conjunction a baby was born, the infernal rite was resumed, all around a little jar of wine, which they called the keg, and they became drunk, and would cut the baby to pieces, and pour its blood into the goblet, and they threw babies on the fire, still alive, and mixed the baby's ashes and his blood and drank. But Michael Psellis wrote this in his book on the workings of devils 300 years ago. Who told you these things? These two highly sensational stories, right, are both of them word for word out of old books. And so William is pressing, who told you these things? By saying who told you these things, he is very gently saying, are you lying, Ubertino? You're telling me that Bentivengo confessed that they actually did all of these things. That's not true. Come on. You know it's not true. You're just plagiarizing that out of old books, right? You made that. You didn't make that up. It would have been better if you had made it. It would have been more plausible if you had made it up, right? You are recycling these old stories and attaching it to these people just in order to try to condemn them. Remember, William already accused Ubertino of lying in order to achieve his holy end, right? Who told you these things? He challenges. They did. Bentivenga and the others, and under torture. There was the idea, and this is an ancient idea, a Roman idea principally, that evidence extracted under torture is particularly reliable. I have a hard time understanding why anyone ever believed this, myself. But in fact, if you know anything about Roman law, you will know that slaves, their evidence is only admissible in court if it is extracted under torture. A confession or testimony that a slave gives, a Roman slave, under Roman law, again, not admissible in court unless the slave has been tortured. Anyway, so we can see that Ubertino is appealing to a similar kind of idea, right? That the presence of torture makes the confession, because is sort of underscores the confession, right? Maureen, it is a horrible justification for torture. That piece of Roman law I find particularly horrifying, because it means that if there's an investigation, like if something if there were a Roman household in which somebody dies under mysterious circumstances and they need to come in and perform a routine investigation, that routine investigation means by definition, like by law, has to include torture. Like you can't just ask people because what they say is not even admissible, right? No matter how cooperative, innocent or cooperative, the people in the household might be, they have to be tortured in order to have their test. I mean, it's horrifying, completely horrifying. Anyway, perhaps, and I would kind of hope I'm misunderstanding that piece of Roman law, and there were exceptions or something, but that's the understanding I've always had of it. Emily says it's also kind of dumb. Yeah, it is kind of dumb. And William definitely agrees with you, Emily. Look at his explanation. Look at his analysis here. There is only one thing that arouses animals more than pleasure, and that is pain. Under torture, you are as if under the dominion of those grasses that produce visions. Everything you have heard told, everything you have read, returns to your mind, as if you were being transported not toward heaven, but toward hell. Under torture, you say not only what the Inquisitor wants, but also what you imagine might please him, because a bond, this truly diabolical, is established between you and him. These things I know, Ubertino. I also have belonged to those groups of men who believe they can produce the truth with white-hot iron. Well, let me tell you, the white heat of truth comes from another flame. Under torture, Bentavenga may have told you the most absurd lies, because it was no longer himself speaking, but his lust, the devils of his soul. Lust? Yes, there is a lust for pain, as there is a lust for adoration, and even a lust for humility. If it took so little to make the rebellious angels direct their ardor away from worship and humility toward pride and revolt, what can we expect of a human being? There, now you know. This was the thought that struck me in the course of my inquisitions, and this is why I gave up that activity. I lacked the courage to investigate the weaknesses of the wicked, because I discovered that they are the same as the weaknesses of the saintly. All right, so this is a really important passage. This is William explaining, right? This is William's own confession about why he stopped being an inquisitor. And notice how he sets it up. Everything you have heard told, everything you have read, returns to your mind as if you were being transported not toward heaven, but toward hell. A diabolical bond is established between the inquisitor and the tortured victim. Notice what he's paralleling this to? Do you see the parallel he's constructing? The language William is using to describe this is deliberately parallel to the language to describe the ecstatic visions that St. Clare, Ubertino St. Clare, had. Right? You can receive visions. Notice he also points out there are certain grasses, there are certain herbs that you can consume that will facilitate the production of visions. Right? Another little piece of shade that he's throwing there. But if you have a vision, you might have a vision in which you're being transported towards heaven, right? He says what happens to a person under torture is like that. they also are taken out of themselves. They also are transported, but not toward heaven, toward hell. There is only one thing that arouses animals more than pleasure, and that is pain. Brief step. It is a brief step. What was the exact phrase? The step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy is very brief. The step between ecstatic vision and hellish vision, between the transcendent pleasure that accompanies the ecstatic vision of heaven and the pain, the transport that is brought about by pain, that brings this diabolical vision, the diabolical encounter in which the Inquisitor is at the center, right? There's a brief step there too, he is suggesting. So yeah, JJ says, I'm sure things producing visions won't come back to be important. Yes. And it's also a total coincidence that we will go straight from here to the conversation with the herbalist, right, who will be talking about those herbs which can induce visions, which may very likely be grown in his garden in the monastery. Yeah, that's likely all to become important there. Look at what William is doing with the word lust. He calls lust, he says it's no longer himself speaking, but his lust, the devils of his soul. Lust is desire. Lust is an illicit desire. A desire that's either inappropriate or that's directed towards an inappropriate, like it's either disproportionate or it's out of place, right? It's directed at an inappropriate object, is when desire becomes lust in this way. And William points out that there is this brief step in all of these things. A lust for adoration, even a lust for humility. There's a brief step, right? A brief step. And all of this points to the heart, the thought, the intentions. Remember, this is all the stuff that William said to the abbot earlier on. He was getting out of the business of drawing conclusions about. Remember when the abbot asked him, why is it that you don't talk about, discovering the diabolical, like the diabolical motivations, right? Or like how the devil has been misleading the person in order to, and William was like, what I do is look at what happened, right? It is enough for me to show that this person killed that other person, right? Why he did it, what was going on in his heart, what his thoughts and intentions were. That is not what matters most to me. Remember when we were talking, he's like, I didn't want to deal with that, right? That's up to God to judge. I'm just going to judge what I can see, right? Remember what we were talking about weeks ago about that. When I was talking about like upwards and downwards, right? That is taking the things that you can see and always sort of moving up the sort of chain of being, right? Interpreting what are the spiritual truths that those things are pointing to, right? What are the universals that you can draw conclusions about from looking at these events and things and what happens, right? That's essentially what the abbot was saying, right? Like by looking at these actions, we can draw conclusions about like what the devil is up to, right? And William's like, no. He goes the other way, right? He's interested in looking at things. and interpreting the things in order to draw conclusions about things, right? What I was characterizing as him moving downward instead of moving upward. Here in this discussion, we can hear William talking about this same idea from a different angle, right? More sort of personal in this way. He is showing why he believes torture to be wrong as well as useless, right? But it also, it's the whole goal of it, right? The pointing, in a sense, the citing of memorable accusations, the baby tossing story, the sex in the dark story, blow out the candles and have a wild orgy and then kill the babies and drink their blood story. All those stories, those sensational stories of old. The recycling of those is exactly the kind of thing you would expect to find among people who are going upwards, who are not interested in what actually happened, right? Notice that the point that William keeps trying to make here is essentially, you didn't prove that anything about what Bentevenga actually did, actually thought, or actually believed. Whether it's Ubertino making this stuff up, or rather not making it up, whether it's him recycling these stories out of the old books and attaching them to Bentevenga and his followers, or whether Bentevenga himself, under torture, was remembering those stories and repeating those things, confessing those things, because he thought that would be just the sort of thing that his torturer would want to hear and might make him stop torturing him, right? Either way, right? We have this, there is a movement away from concrete conclusions, right? From things and towards ideas, towards abstractions. And this, the way that this works out, the way that kind of translates into the Inquisitor's torture situation that William is describing is the most visceral and horrifying illustration of the dangers of this kind of thing. Eric, Eric is asking, do we have any documents from Inquisitors that recount something like William's concerns here? The Inquisition stuff is never stuff that I really studied. So I don't know. I have very little direct information about the Inquisitors and what they were sort of up to, and how they talked about these things. I'm familiar with ways in which I've encountered various sort of recyclings of this kind in, popular literature, or even things like confessional manuals and stuff like that. Eric, my own medieval studies were mostly focused on English vernacular stuff, especially in the 14th century. So I've read a bunch of, especially vernacular things there. So I don't know much about those originals there. But anyway, that there were people who thought that what the Inquisitors were doing was a bad idea. I feel very confident of that. It is a thing, actually. It's another assumption that modern people make about medievals, is that you couldn't I used to run into this all the time, that you couldn't, dissenting voices weren't tolerated, right? That if you if you spoke against anything that was going on or anything that the church said or did, you'd get in trouble. You could get in trouble. People did get in trouble, but people criticize the established church, and especially the Pope and the prelates, all the time, like all the time. There is a lot of dissent, and whether or not it crosses the line and gets you condemned is largely, to return back to the beginning of our conversation, a political question very often. It came up for me all the time with Chaucer, right? Like modern students had a really hard time believing that Chaucer was being as satirical as he was, like the fun that he was making of the church figures in the Canterbury Tales. So often, not 100% of them, but anyway, like my students were always like sort of shocked and appalled. It like violated their sensibilities in some way. You know, they were like, oh, how did he get away with that? Like, but it's, and honestly, I think this seems to me to come from a modern sense of, a totalitarian state, or, a sort of a modern dystopia. How, like, the kind of powers that they can, like basically when people read Orwell and then, think about the medieval church, and they think about the, the power and the authority of the medieval church, and sort of imagine that they had both the inclination and the power to enforce, to police thought crime and that sort of thing. And it's not really the case much at all. As I said, there were definitely some lines that you would cross that even without like a big political reason, people would be like, okay, hang on now. Like that's, you've gone a little far. But honestly, just saying bad things about the Pope, you've got to go really far. I mean, you see how many times we're calling popes the Antichrist in this book, right? Like it's there's almost nothing you can do as far as insulting the Pope goes that'll get you in trouble. I mean, again, politics may create that situation for sure. You could become Dante, for instance, and get exiled from Florence. But in general, having a dissenting opinion was much more common, and the distribution of dissenting opinions was much easier than modern people tend to think about it. Anyway, okay. All right, let's keep going. He looked at Ubertino. He looked around, staring wide-eyed among the dark naves, as if the Antichrist were going to appear at any moment, and I actually expected to glimpse him. His lieutenants are already here, dispatched as Christ dispatched the apostles into the world. They are trampling on the city of God, seducing through deceit, hypocrisy, violence. It will be then that God will have to send his servants, Elijah and Enoch, whom he maintained alive in the earthly paradise, so that one day they may confound the Antichrist, and they will come to prophesy clad in sackcloth, and they will preach penance by word and by example. They have already come, Ubertino, William said, indicating his Franciscan habit. But they have not yet triumphed. This is the moment when the Antichrist, filled with rage, will command the killing of Enoch and Elijah and the exposure of their bodies for all to see, and thus be afraid of imitating them, just as they wanted to kill me. At that moment, terrified, I thought Ubertino was in the power of a kind of holy frenzy, and I feared for his reason. Now, with the distance of time, knowing what I know, namely, that 2 years later he would be mysteriously killed in a German city by a murderer never discovered, I am all the more terrified, because obviously that evening Ubertino was prophesying. this is another one of those moments where Adso comes in with a conclusion to a paragraph that takes me completely by surprise, right? Remember that moment at the end of the church door? Oh my goodness, we are going back to the church door. But remember when he has his vision, right? He has his vision that's inspired by the church door. And if you know the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, you will recognize that like almost every word in his vision is a quotation from the book of Revelation. And he has that moment where he says, then I realized what my vision really was of. And I'm expecting him to say, it was the book of Revelation, right? Like it was in fact like, it wasn't my vision at all. It was just like, me remembering the apocalypse. That is the apocalypse. That's the name. That's the word Revelation. That's what it means. The apocalypse of St. John. It's the title of the book. But he doesn't say that, right? Instead, he says, and that's when I realized that vision was about what was happening right then at that abbey, right? And it's the same, thing that goes like, at the moment terrified, I thought he was in a kind of holy frenzy and I feared for his reason. Now with the distance of time, knowing what I know, stop. Where I expect him to go is, now I see, no, he was just crazy, right? Remember the whole, has Adso been listening to the entire conversation about the brief step between ecstatic vision and sinful frenzy, right? No, not so much, actually, right? And he's like, now I know that Ubertino was prophesying that night. Now I'm even more terrified than I was then, right? It's not that now in retrospect he sees through Ubertino. It's now in retrospect he ascribes even more significance to that, right? Anyway, I find that really interesting. Think about prophecy. What is prophecy? Prophecy are words that point to truth, that point to a reality that can transcend time. Sometimes it's pointing to a future reality. Sometimes it's pointing to a higher reality, right? But prophecy are signs that are sort of freighted with truth in this special and unusual way. And the end of the conversation with Ubertino is Adso interpreting Ubertino's words as prophetic. Let me see. I'm going to give myself 4 minutes or less to explain Elijah and Enoch. Okay. Go. In the book of Revelation, there is a passage where St. John describes 2 witnesses that when the dragon and the Antichrist are in control of the world, there will be 2 witnesses who will come forth to stand against them. And they will proclaim the truth against the Antichrist. And they will be the witnesses of God. But then they will be killed. They will be martyred, right? They will be taken by the beast and they will be slain. But then they will rise again. They will be resurrected. And then they ascend and it's a big moment in sort of the drama of the story of Revelation. It was common in identifying. So in talking about Elijah and Enoch, he's alluding to that story of the 2 witnesses who are martyred. the two witnesses who stand against Antichrist and are martyred, but then are raised again. It was a commonplace for those two witnesses to be identified with Elijah and Enoch. That's what he's doing. He's taking it, Ubertino's taking it for granted that those two witnesses from the book of Revelation are Elijah and Enoch. Trivia question. Do you know why? Hebrew Bible trivia question. What do Elijah and Enoch have in common? That's it. They were taken to heaven bodily. They did not die. Yes, they did not die. Both of them were taken bodily into heaven to be with God. The rationale here is that these two witnesses are sent by God. But it's only appointed, we're told that it's only appointed to everybody to die once. So the two witnesses sent by God couldn't be anybody else from the history of the church, right? Whether the Old Testament saints or the New Testament saints, because they're killed. And you can't so it's like Moses wouldn't qualify because Moses died, right? So you're not going to re-kill Moses, right? That doesn't happen, right? But Elijah and Enoch are candidates, right? Because it does so happen that there were two people that are mentioned in the Old Testament as going up directly to be with God without dying. So this was a very, very standard identification of those two witnesses with Elijah and Enoch. Also, both of them are associated with prophecy. Elijah, for the very good reason that he was one of the most famous prophets of the Old Testament, and Enoch, there were prophecies associated with Enoch that were in wide circulation at the time of the writing of the New Testament, some of which materials are included in the deuterocanonical materials that are still to this day part of the Catholic Bible. You will hear references to the prophecies of Enoch in the book of Jude. Isn't it Jude in the New Testament? Who alludes to the prophecies of Enoch? Yeah. It's a very popular first century Second Temple Jewish prophecy. It didn't make the cut for the Bible, and especially not the Protestant Bible. But anyway, Enoch was associated with prophecy too, is the point. Anyway, Ubertino is saying, as others have suggested in this book already, that the events of the book of Revelation are taking place right now. All right, that was 5 minutes, not 4, but I'll take it. Just in case this comes out to be relevant, I'm trying to explain, if you have time, I would heartily recommend a read or a reread of the book of Revelation. It will help understand many, many, many things that are being alluded to in this book. Yeah. Okay. Keep going. Hey, we made it to the library. Just a few things in the conversation with the librarian. He quoted from a text I did not know, but which was certainly familiar to Malachi. That is, William is quoting in Malachi, the librarian is quoting this. So William is quoting this text, and Malachi, the librarian, is familiar with it. The librarian must have a list of all books, carefully ordered by subjects and authors, and they must be classified on the shelves with numerical indications. How do you know the collocation of each book? He's trying to get from the librarian how his library is organized, right? Malachi showed him some annotations beside each title. I read 3, 4 gratis, 5 in prima Graecorum, 2, 5 gratis, 7 in tertia anglorum, and so on. I understood that the first number indicated the position of the book on the shelf or gradus, which was in turn indicated by the second number, while the case was indicated by the third number, and I understood also that the other phrases designated a room or a corridor of the library, and I made bold to ask further information about these last distinctions. Malachi looked at me sternly. Perhaps you do not know or have forgotten that only the librarian is allowed access to the library. It is therefore right and sufficient that only the librarian know how to decipher these things. The reason I was interested in this passage, of course, is not only a reminder about the secret of the library and all of that stuff, is that this comes into these really important themes that we've been tracing, because what we have here are signs which are designed to be confusing, right? I was just talking about prophecy. You know, all words, remember we were talking about things and signs and words, right? Everything is a thing. Signs are a subset of things. There are some things that also are signs and point to other things. And then there are words, which are a subset of signs because they're also things. A word is still a thing. But the only point of a word is to point to, they're the only signs that are merely signs and nothing else. So the whole point of words is to point to things. But there are lots of interesting categories of words, right? When you think about that, when you think about the point of words, there are interesting categories. Prophecy is one interesting category, right? The particular weight, the particular authority with which a prophecy points to a thing. But it can point to it very indirectly. A prophecy is often very hard to interpret. It points to a thing. It has authority, but it's not necessarily clear. It doesn't necessarily do a good job of pointing, right? It isn't necessarily clear. And here, notice we have a new category: ciphers, code, words, signs, which are, on the one, like I said, these are designed to convey information to the librarian, right? These are signs that literally point to things. Like they point the way to these books. So the little annotations next to the titles of the books, the titles of the books themselves are signs which point to a thing, right? The title points to the book. It identifies the book. It's the name of the book, right? These annotations are literally directions pointing to where you can find the book, right? How you go from the idea of the book to actually holding the physical book in your hand, right? Those annotations show the librarian how to do that. So they're this really kind of interesting special case of the sign, and yet they're designed to be, they're purposed to be uninterpretable by other things, right? So that's a really interesting category, and it invokes the question about like names and about things and the issue of the library. Spielkalb, is the library a symbol for dogmatic hidden knowledge with all its complicated ways to access it, and the way our protagonists need to explore this on danger of their lives as a metaphor of the empirical way of science to gain knowledge? We'll explore that, right? But these are exactly the things, like, this is why we're seeing all this stuff as we go through, right? It's kind of preparing us for this. The library is the repository of knowledge. But remember back in the conversation with the abbot, knowledge is dangerous, right? And So the library is a danger to your soul and a danger to your life as well, because you can get lost there. But anyway, the hiding of knowledge, the preservation of knowledge, and the hiding of knowledge. What is good to read? Adso's agitation at hearing the particular condemnation of sexual desire that Ubertino was giving, right? All of these things about, all of these things are ways in which we've been prompted to think about what words do, what books do, what are the effects of words. It's interesting. As much as William focuses on things, right, instead of ideas, he focuses down on things. He likes to focus on what can be clearly and objectively observed. What have we gotten so far in this book to this point? Words, right? What's happened in this book so far in day one? People talking. That's what's happened, right? Lots of conversations. And I don't think that that's an accident, right? Now, other things have happened. We've already gotten hints that things have occurred already. We got a dark hint about that scream that they heard, which the abbot dismissed as the pigs being slaughtered. We saw evidence that pigs were indeed slaughtered, right, in the vat of blood. That was out in the courtyard. And I don't know about you, but I'm hoping that that particular vat of blood, that nobody slew the blood of a victim and mingled it with the blood that was going to be drunk by others. Oh, wait, just like those heretics did with the blood of babies, right? I hope nobody did that, right? That'd be awful, wouldn't it? But we did kind of see the big, huge vat of pig blood, which is going to be made into blood puddings and stuff. I mean, it's there to be eaten, it's destined for monthly consumption, that vat of blood. They didn't drink the pig's blood exactly. They used it. They made it into puddings and blood sausage and things like that. Yeah. No, it's being that vat of blood was intended to be used for culinary purposes. 100%. Anyway. So if you're remembering Ubertino's wild stories about the vat of wine, which they called the keg, and in which they mingled the blood of the babies that they had taken, like the incestuous babies that they then murdered, and mingled the blood with the wine and drank it in a blasphemous sacrament. Just saying. Seems relevant. That's what I was thinking of when we passed the big, huge vat of pig blood that we're stirring, especially in the context of Adso's ominous hints of the day before. Okay. All right, let's... it's late. All right, let's stop there. We will get to Adelmo's drawings next time and the objections of the blind and elderly... Oh, what's his face? I'm forgetting his name. Is it Joachim? Anyway, we'll get there, and then we'll touch briefly. I don't have too much to say about the conversation with the herbalist. Couple things to say about the conversation with the Master Glazier. But let me tell you this. I'm pretty confident that next time we're going to finish day one. It's totally going to happen. Sooner or later, I'm going to run out of that's a whole, this is opening up a whole big medieval, kettle of fish. I'm sure I'm going to run out of things like that. I'm going to have to contextualize. All right. Thanks, everybody. I will. I will see you guys next time. Again, we'll definitely go through the end of day one. As I say, if you get a chance and are so inclined, I'm not going to force you, but it will help you to understand many references if you read the Book of Revelation. It's not a long read. It's a bit of a page turner in places. But for people who are here live, I won't be here next week. Indeed, tragically, I won't be here for the next 2 weeks. I'm traveling with my family next week, and then I'll be at Comic-Con the week after that, or I'll be flying to Comic-Con the week after that. Next session will be on July 31st. Alas. But, all right. Thanks, folks. See you guys soon. Bye now.